Thank you, David, and thank you, Matt. Thanks everyone for being here. I have, as Matt said, I've been on this journey, and I'm very excited to share with you uh, the basic thesis in a new book that'll be out in about 12 days called The Entrepreneurial Mindset Advantage. And so let me just jump into that, and we'll get started. What I'm most excited about is I want to kind of get the basic ideas out there, but I'm most excited about the opportunity to engage with you all and see how this lands and how you're hearing this or how you see this might be useful in your world and your work. So let me figure out how to do the screen sharing thing here. I think I'm good. Let me get that out of the way. Hold on. Okay, you all can see my screen all right? That looks good. Okay. So, the subtitle of my book is The Hidden Logic That Unleashes Human Potential. And I could forgive you for seeing that and assuming it to be hyperbole, but I hope to convince you in the next 30 minutes that it's not. That the ideas in this book and more than 30 years of research will show the ways in which a subtle shift in our perspective can make an enormous impact in our lives. So I've been on this journey since the early 90s, and asking these questions, I became obsessed with this idea, like, what is an entrepreneurial mindset? And I became obsessed with this when I saw a story in the newspaper about a man who'd lost his job. It was in the early 90s. And it was like a human interest story in the Metro section. 1991, January 27th, 1991. The guy had lost his job. He's sitting on the sofa next to his wife. Unemployment's running out. She's working two shifts at a minimum wage job somewhere, trying to hold it together. And through my own experience as an entrepreneur, I looked at this story and I said, I can see opportunities everywhere. Why can't he? And so my assumptions were that I'm no smarter than this guy, that it has very little to do with my dispositional traits. That what my assumptions were that because I have been functioning for some time as an entrepreneur, that my brain is wired differently. And I couldn't really articulate it any more than that I have learned to see the world differently because of my circumstances, not because of my dispositional traits. Those were my original assumptions. So I set out to understand what exactly is an entrepreneurial mindset and how is it different from a non-entrepreneurial mindset. And people ask me very often, well, Gary, tell me exactly what is an entrepreneurial mindset? Like I'm going to say that to you in one sentence. And my reply to this question sometimes is, well, I don't know, but why don't you tell me what a non-entrepreneurial mindset is? And then you'll start to answer your own question, right? But more broadly, like, why do some people think and act this way while others don't? And so these basic questions, look, this was 1991. I had no idea what I was doing, but my assumptions were that if I could somehow understand these basic questions, it could be useful to people like this guy in the story. So I was also assuming that, it's not just about startup, that there's something bigger and broader. And at the time, I couldn't articulate it. And, honestly, I feel that, like, Jung said that we don't have ideas, they have us. That certainly felt right to me. Like this idea overtook me. And so it set me on this path to understand, to deconstruct the entrepreneurial mindset. And I went about it sort of from an anthropological perspective. I wasn't really interested in like the big name entrepreneurs. I wasn't really interested in studying the outliers, Elon Musk or the Richard Bransons or the billionaire entrepreneurs. I set out to understand how people who have nothing create something. So I was really interested in understanding everyday entrepreneurs. How do they recognize opportunities that the rest of us overlook? And then how do they bring their ideas to life in spite of their circumstances? And I began interviewing entrepreneurs in my own community. I began reading biographies of entrepreneurs. As I said, I didn't know what I was doing. Now, fast forward to 2008, I got hired by the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute in San Jose to do a gap analysis on entrepreneurship education in North America. And very quickly, we found that the way entrepreneurship is being portrayed in the classroom is almost entirely divorced from what a typical entrepreneur is actually doing. I mean, that became abundantly clear very, very quickly. And Cisco said to me, remember, this is 2008, well, what are they actually doing? And at the time, there wasn't a lot of data. And there was some, but not a lot. And so I convinced Cisco to let me do some ethnographic research. And they gave me a budget to travel around the United States and interview 200 everyday entrepreneurs. And, again, I didn't really know what I was doing. In the beginning, I started hearing all kinds of crazy stories. But pretty soon, I began to detect like these common and predictable underlying patterns of deeply held beliefs, taken for granted values and assumptions, of which the entrepreneurs themselves were largely unaware, right? Most of what they knew, most of the knowledge they had acquired was acquired implicitly. So their knowledge was tacit and they weren't able to clearly articulate exactly what was happening. Nevertheless, I began to recognize these common patterns, what an anthropologist, and I know Matt is here as a sociologist to keep me honest, but an anthropologist would refer to these as cultural themes. These common underlying cultural themes kept coming up. And there was one story that really captivated my heart and my imagination. I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I interviewed a man named Clifton Talbert, who was one of the founders of Stairmaster, the exercise. And my opening question very often is, how did you become an entrepreneur? What put you on an entrepreneurial path? Do you feel like you were born that way, or was there a person or a situation that influenced you to be entrepreneurial? And Clifton started to explain to me that he was born in the Mississippi Delta in the 1940s, born to a teenage mother, didn't know a father. He was picking cotton. He said that was the expected way of life. Mr. Walter's field truck came every morning at 6. And he said that would have been my future had it not been for my Uncle Cleve. And he pulled this picture out of a shoebox and said, that's the man that taught me how to think like an entrepreneur. And he explained to me that Uncle Cleve had a 4th grade education. He was the direct descendant of slaves, but he was the only guy in his town that had money in the bank. He didn't wear his money on his sleeve. By all intents and purposes, Clifton described his uncle as a stoic. And so he started to tell me from a 13-year-old boy's perspective, 13-year-old African-American perspective in the Mississippi Delta, following around this man, there's something different about my uncle. I can't put my finger on it, but there's something different about him. And he described walking into the bank. They weren't allowed into the bank. They had to go in the back door. And little Clifton being enamored or intimidated in this big institutional environment where they weren't welcome. But nevertheless, his Uncle Cleve walked up to the teller and pulled his passbook out of his bib overalls and so forth. And so, long story short, that story became the inspiration for my first book that Clifton and I authored in 2010. It's called Who Owns the Ice House? 8 Life Lessons from an Unlikely Entrepreneur. Those are the cultural themes that emerged from hundreds of interviews. We got some funding from the Kauffman Foundation and created a training program and a curriculum around it that is now spread all over the world. As David said, we've been recognized at the United Nations and so forth. So that's kind of where I got started, like in earnest. The book was published in 2010. But almost immediately after the book came out, we were starting to train people at the Kauffman Foundation, and people started showing up and then embracing these ideas and taking them into communities and places that I could never have imagined. People started using our program in like reentry programs in colleges and universities and middle schools. Like the breadth of the application was stunning to me. But I also began to recognize there's something bigger here. I've stumbled into something much bigger than I anticipated. And so I continued to do the interviews and continued to school myself in ethnographic research and to figure out, what's happening here. But I also started to look at the literature and motivation research, sociology, psychology, and so forth, to really understand why are some people behaving this way while others aren't. And the answers to these questions, I think, have profound implications for how we think about learning and work in today's rapidly changing, highly complex world. So in the little bit of time we have today, I want to use first principles to try to get to the meat of this quickly as possible. I want to talk about mindset and I want to talk about entrepreneurship. And if we can talk about these things separately for a moment, it'll begin to make a bit more sense. So in the beginning, I struggled to find out any real meaningful framework, a clinical framework for mindset. And one of the first places I went was Carol Dweck. And, I was disappointed to see that she defined mindset as a way of thinking. So I was really struggling there. Like the definitions of, I couldn't really find any meaningful definition of mindset. And as luck would have it, or serendipity, or whatever you want to call it, I stumbled across Edgar Schein's work in culture. And it dawned on me that a mindset is to a person what culture is to a group. And that understanding allowed me to really clarify what is a mindset and what is its purpose from an evolutionary perspective, and how it can hinder or enhance our ability to thrive. In my book on I have a chapter called The Origins and Evolutions of the Managerial Mindset. And the premise there is that the entrepreneurial mindset only seems enigmatic to us to the extent that we are steeped in managerial paradigms. And so I open this chapter with the now famous anecdote from David Foster Wallace's 2008 Kenyon College commencement address, in which he talks about the 2 young fish are swimming along and they pass the older fish. And as they pass, the older fish says to the younger fish, "Good morning, fellas. How's the water?" And the two young fish just continue to swim along until one of them looks at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" And I think that's a useful introduction to understanding that, and my friend Matt Lee will help with me with this, but you can't understand an other person's mindset / culture until we realize that we are looking at the world through our own. And we fail to understand entrepreneurship because of an ethnocentric perspective. We don't acknowledge that we are steeped in managerial thinking. And so let me continue here. So again, a big awareness for me was this understanding that a mindset is to a person what culture is to a group. It functions exactly the same. So I took Schein's definition of culture as a pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration. That's worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. You guys get that, right? So I took Schein's definition and flipped it to mindset as a pattern of values, beliefs, and assumptions learned by an individual that has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore assumed to be the correct way to perceive, think, and feel. So again, referring back to Schein, I'm going to use his iceberg model of culture. On the surface are the visible artifacts and the observable behaviors. Beneath the surface, we find explicit knowledge and espoused values. But there's a deeper level 3 where we find our deeply held values and taken for granted assumptions. And what Schein points out is that it's not our level 2 knowledge and espoused values that create the outcomes in our lives. It's the deeply held, taken for granted values and assumptions. So I like to spin on something that Deming said, which is that a mindset is a belief system that is perfectly designed to create the outcomes that it creates. And I think that's about 99% of our work is getting people to understand that. But it's also important to recognize that the brain is an efficiency-oriented mechanism, that we're inundated with billions of bits of data every second. And our brains are constantly filtering out everything deemed non-threatening or irrelevant. And our brains also rely upon simplification systems. So we learn things, and sometimes we learn things at level 2, and sometimes we learn them through the forces of socialization at level 3, right? But let's just say we learn something, and once we learn it and accept a particular schema, let's call it, as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel, our brains automate that schema in order to reduce the cognitive load. So it drops beneath our conscious awareness so that we can think without thinking. It's an efficiency mechanism. The problem is that once a schema drops to level 3, we lose sight of it. We're not aware of it any longer, yet it's still driving our behavior. Now, here's my point. That happens at the individual level, at the organizational level, at a cultural and societal level. And part of what I'm arguing is that the industrial era assumptions of the last century have become so deeply embedded in our individual and collective consciousness that we're no longer aware of them, yet they're still influencing our behavior in many ways, of which are rapidly becoming maladaptive in the face of change. So that's a quick primer on my understanding of mindset. There's so much more there. I'm so fond of saying that my work is 99% mindset and 1% entrepreneurship. Let me talk about entrepreneurship very briefly here. You know, as Matt said in his remarks, this word is so misunderstood. And if you look it up in the dictionary, you're probably going to come across the same definition that arose in the 18th century. Like it's someone who takes a risk in exchange for a profit. Having interviewed more than 500 entrepreneurs on 5 continents, I've not seen evidence for that. And to characterize the entrepreneur as someone who is motivated by profit is a gross mischaracterization of the underlying factors that are driving the behavior. To the best of my understanding from an ethnographic perspective, there is almost always a purpose-driven component to the work. And you know, the other problem is there's this visibility versus representation issue. I attend these conferences all around the world, these entrepreneurship ecosystem conferences, and they start talking about tech transfer and venture capital, and they betray, you know, their level 3 assumptions show up in their language. It's skewed towards this 0.1% of entrepreneurs. And oh, by the way, the venture-backed high-growth entrepreneurs fail at a much higher rate than a typical everyday entrepreneur does. I'm not denigrating venture-backed high-growth entrepreneurship. All this is to say that there is a vast reservoir of untapped entrepreneurial potential in people and places that we're overlooking or ignoring. So ultimately, I'm now defining entrepreneurship as the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. And this took me 25 years to pen this definition. And what it's really rooted in is the assumption that you can embrace this idea, as Matt has intimated, in your job. You can, you know, someone who has a minimum wage Amazon job can embrace this idea that it's up to me to figure out how to make myself useful, which, by the way, represents a subtle yet powerful shift from an external to an internal locus of control. But the second half of my definition is where the real power lies. It's that by creating value for others, we empower ourselves. And I don't mean empower necessarily economically. I mean, we empower ourselves by tapping into the most potent form of human motivation called intrinsic motivation. So I created this mashup between Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory and Senge's work. So what Csikszentmihalyi is saying is like when the challenge exceeds our skill, we become very anxious and it's difficult to function. When our skill exceeds the challenge, we become bored and disengaged. Here's a fun fact. 2/3 of kids leave high school not engaged in learning. 2/3 of workers in North America are not engaged in their work. The number globally is 87% not engaged. I'll let you think about that for a moment. The colossal waste of human capacity. What Senge said is like, look, if here's your current reality and here's the future you're trying to create. If you can't tolerate what Senge called creative tension, you'll just lower the goal. But if you can tolerate the creative tension, the ambiguity tolerance is what Kahneman, Tversky would call it, right? You'll start moving towards the goal and you'll become optimally engaged. Csikszentmihalyi called it flow state. He called it autotelic. And it pissed me off that he died before I had a chance to talk to him because he's constantly using examples of musicians and athletes, but he never talked about the entrepreneur because they're exemplars of people who are optimally engaged. So part of this work that I'm doing is is born of this idea of self-determination theory. And thank God these guys, Deci and Ryan, brought us out of the dark ages of behaviorists, do this and you'll get that, punish, reward thinking. Although our systems of education are still reliant entirely on extrinsic rewards or threat of punishment. But the need for autonomy, competency, and relatedness, Deci and Ryan point out, are the psychological nutrients that are necessary for lifelong growth, social integration, and psychological well-being. Matt and I have been talking about this. I'm probably going to change this to optimal engagement theory. But when a human being autonomously pursues her interests and develops her capabilities in ways that create value for other people, in that intersection, we tap into the most potent form of human motivation. So my theory here is that the entrepreneur unwittingly, like Mr. Magoo, stumbles into the trifecta of human motivation. In my book, I quoted Scott Barry Kaufman, who described the need for purpose as the need for an overarching, self-organizing, future-oriented aspiration that energizes one's efforts and provides a central source of meaning and significance in one's life. So what it comes down to in my mind, as far as I can tell, the single most important factor that distinguishes an entrepreneur from a non-entrepreneur is a compelling goal. And the research here is quite compelling, no pun intended. Look at Seligman's prospection theory. When our brains are oriented towards some sort of positive future, we're able to access problem-solving abilities that are otherwise not available to us. So what is a non-entrepreneurial mindset, right? It's a managerial mindset. And when we understand the underlying values, the level 3 values and assumptions of a managerial mindset, they're rooted in assumptions of productivity and efficiency. The assumptions are that the useful thing is already known and that we're in the process of replicating and distributing a known useful thing. So the focus is narrow, it's very efficiency-based, and we need that. The problem is that managerial values and assumptions are intolerant of exploration, experimentation, and adaptation. Attitudes and skills that are entirely absent from the curriculum. So the managerial mindset was once sufficient. The managerial mindset is appropriate in stable conditions, but it's maladaptive in dynamism and change. And the key for anyone to survive in the new world in which we live is to know which situation you are in so you know which mindset to apply. As Heifetz said, the greatest failure of leadership is to treat an adaptive challenge as if it were a technical problem. If all you have is a managerial mindset, all of your problems are going to look like nails. So here's the windup here, folks. What I've seen, in interviewing these entrepreneurs, I'm often struck by the banality of the individual. I struggle very often, not always, but very often to detect any charisma, brilliance, creativity, anything that would distinguish them. And, we're all familiar with the banality of evil, right? Hannah Arendt and Philip Zimbardo and all these social psychologists that have shown us that we know how to create the conditions that will cause good people to do bad things. But we now also know, and I borrowed this from Philip Zimbardo because this is where his work took him at the end of his life. God rest his soul. The banality of heroism. We now know how to create the conditions where ordinary people will do extraordinary things. So that's a quick overview of my book. It's going to be out in about 12 days. If you want to pre-order a copy, it's available wherever books are sold. And I'm happy to talk to you about any of these ideas. I'm happy to come to your organization and do a book talk if that's of any interest to you. But I'm going to stop the screen share now, hopefully. And David, we can send these slides so people will have connections to all of this. So
that's wonderful. Thank you, Gary. Thank you so much for that introduction to your work. And I know there's a many layers of depth beneath what you shared with us, but already I found that fascinating. So we're going to have some discussion. We'll begin by moving to breakout rooms. I'm going to invite you. I'll move you in a second to breakout rooms of 3 or 4 people. I'm going to invite you to think about. So Gary, you reject the idea of an entrepreneur just being someone who will take a risk in order to generate profit. And you said beautifully that actually people in any kind of industry or any kind of work environment can have an entrepreneurial mindset. Now, this is the thing that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. It seems to me that there are some kinds of situation where entrepreneurship is required, and it requires kind of some step into the unknown. So you think about someone who's working in an industry and they realize through their day-to-day work there's some kind of thing, some piece of the puzzle that's missing that could unlock enormous value. And they try talking to people in their business about it. No one's interested. And they see this opportunity that if they just left their job, they could be the one that creates this new insight or widget or piece, whatever it is. But that seems to be where enormous value lies. But also it does require this step out into the unknown and this kind of step out into risk. And I'm just interested to know your thoughts on whether risk plays any role in entrepreneurship.
Oh, yeah, you're just going to get me all fired up now, David. There's a part in my book, and it was I forgot who wrote about this, but like if there's anything entrepreneurs have in common, if there's any one single trait, and the research bears this out, that entrepreneurs have in common, it is that they are risk averse. So the idea, like you say the word entrepreneur in a group, and it's going to be like less than 15 seconds before somebody says risk. It's just not the way. And so David, your comments also betray some underlying assumptions that I'd like to challenge. That what the typical entrepreneur is doing, and which is what I'm advocating for, don't quit your day job. Don't drop out of school. Don't mortgage your house. Don't disrupt the core of what you're doing, but reappropriate some modicum of your discretionary thought, time, out on the perimeter, micro experimenting with new ways to make yourself more useful to more humans. The other idea that you hinted at, David, is that ideas sort of come out of the sky as a bolt of lightning, as a flash. It doesn't happen that way. It's a very slow, iterative, like lots of bad ideas lead to good ideas. And moreover, like access to resources is harmful to the discovery process. Harmful. And what's happening here, these underdog entrepreneurs, it's the lack of resources. What's going on? Okay. It's the lack of resources that forces them to micro experiment in the margins. They're not business planning, they're developing minimally viable products that become these beautiful little mechanisms that allow them to engage with the world. Now, remember, needs are unarticulated. They're level 3. Most people's unmet needs are level 3. They're not posting job boards. Hey, somebody do this for me. Somebody do that for me. It requires the skills of a detective or a scientist. Now, let me back up one step, David. There's something organic happening here. Of the 500 or more entrepreneurs I've interviewed, a tiny percentage of them, and I'm sorry I didn't keep track of this, of tiny percentage of them had any training whatsoever in entrepreneurship. And so that causes us to make what psychologists would call the fundamental attribution error. There's some sort of scientifically unfathomable genetic phenomenon happening there that causes the behavior. Well, ask yourself, how does an organism orient itself in unfamiliar terrain? It tries lots of little things on a very small scale to increase the probability that it will survive long enough to find a connection. That's what I've advocated in my new book. You have to reappropriate some modicum of your discretionary time out on the edges to explore new ways to make yourself more useful to more humans.
Gary, thank you so much. Well, you're blowing many of the assumptions that I have about entrepreneurship out of the water, and I'm really appreciative of that. Thank you so much. I'd love to hear from others as well, whether you want to put that in the chat or someone wants to come off mute and tell us. Lyndon, you just unmuted yourself. Please go ahead.
Yeah, cheers. Yeah, hello, David. Hello, Gary. Good to see everyone. And I was just going to say, in my breakout session, Rana brought up the idea of the degree of overlap between leadership mindsets and the entrepreneurial mindset is much greater in that Venn diagram than you would typically see in the management mindset versus the entrepreneurial mindset that Gary so nicely articulated. And we also touched on some of the trends in the management side of things, including the idea of social entrepreneurship as just a huge area of interest and growth on the educational side of the equation these days. So that's about as far as we got. But I thought I would share some of that.
Thank you very much. And very appropriate for the Humanistic Leadership Academy. Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're wanting to do. Yeah, please. Michael Pearson, I see you've unmuted yourself. I don't know whether you wanted to say something.
Actually, it was by mistake. I apologize, but I appreciate the conversation. And thank you, Gary.
Thank you. I'll just say this while you guys are thinking about a question. I learned more about entrepreneurship from the most unlikely source, and that's Karl Marx. Like, that sounds so counterintuitive, right? But if you read Marx's work on alienation theory, why workers are alienated from their work, go read that theory. Look at the data on student engagement. Look at what teacher burnout. Students and teachers are alienated from their species essence for precisely the same reasons Marx lays out there, right? But Marx also contemplated an entrepreneurial economy. He never used the word entrepreneur, but his note on James Mill, he said, what if we could exchange as humans? We would both benefit in two ways. Like, I would first benefit because I am manifesting who I am into the product or service I provide. So I benefit by doing that. And then I benefit doubly when you say that thing that you created, that's a manifestation of who you are, is useful to me. I benefit again, and then that works with both of us, you doing the same.
Thank you, Gary.
And to what Matt said at the beginning, this is ultimately about human flourishing. Matt invited me to present these ideas at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard a few weeks ago. And that's why I'm delighted to be talking to you guys. It doesn't have anything to do with business. It's really not. I mean, it does, but it doesn't. It's really about, we all live by exchanging, as Adam Smith once said. So the questions become, what is the useful thing that you exchange? With whom do you exchange it? And is it an other directed exchange or a self-directed exchange? And more importantly, what are the means by which you learn how to make yourself useful to other humans? Is that a self-directed process or is that an other-directed process? And my takeaway, and I agree with you, Matt, that this is ultimately an act of love. When we pursue the things that are naturally interesting to us in ways that create value for others, we become optimally engaged. That's not hyperbole. That is well established in the literature. That carrot and stick, do this and you'll get that, is an impoverished view of humanity. And yet our systems of education and our organizational structures are still reliant upon these underlying level 3 values and assumptions.
Thank you. Well, the questions and the hands are coming thick and fast now, and we're just running up against time. We will finish just on the hour. Gary, I just want to check with you. Perhaps, are you happy for people to get in touch with you if they've got questions or whatever? Happy to share email contact. Great.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to do a webinar if you want me to, do a deeper dive for your organization. I'd be happy to do a webinar. I'd be happy to come to your organization and do a more in-depth talk or whatever. I'm in the very early stages of the book promotion. It's gotten rave reviews, not the least of which came from Matt Lee.
Well, we just, I think we've got time just for one more little comment. And so if it's okay, I'm just going to pick one that I think will be a good summary for all of those who are here. And as I say, anyone else who wants to get in touch with Gary, do make contact directly for that. I'm sorry we don't have time for all of them, but just Jeffrey asked if you could change one thing about undergraduate business education so that it more fully aligns with your insights. What change would you make for all the educators here? I think that's a very valuable question.
I would make entrepreneurship like an introductory thing for all students to take. Like I don't want to offend, but like the business school is where entrepreneurship goes to die. I'm sorry to say that. Like, look, if you ask 100 students, how many of you want to start their own business? Maybe you're going to get 30 hands, 40 hands going up, right? If you ask that same crowd, how many people want to discover opportunities? Every hand in the room is going to go up. And so there are many, like probably 40% of the entrepreneurs I've interviewed start by telling me, I've never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. But once they discover something that's useful to other humans, then they start thinking, oh shit, now I need to figure out business stuff so I can get my useful thing to other people. Let's stop putting the cart in front of the horse. Sorry, got me going there, David.
Gary, thank you so much. Well, look, your passion for this is infectious. I think you have caused a lot of us to think in new ways. I just really appreciate your input today. And as I say, do follow up on this. You're welcome to get the book or get in touch with Gary. But Gary, thank you to you. And thank you to all of you who've been on this call today for joining us. And you can find out more. We still have another after the Thanksgiving break here in the United States. Michael Pearson will be speaking to us in our final webinar in this series, and I'll put the link to that in the chat as well. So thank you all for joining us. I hope you have a safe and peaceful rest of the day and next couple of weeks. And if you're joining us in a couple of weeks' time, I look forward to seeing you then. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.